The evening mist clung to the burned-out homestead like smoke from a funeral pyre. And in that gray twilight, two figures stood silhouetted against the skeletal remains of what had once been the Morrison family farm. The blackened timbers jutted skyward like accusing fingers, and the smell of ash mixed with something else, something that made even hardened men breathe through their mouths. Reginald Pike surveyed the destruction with the satisfied air of a craftsman admiring his handiwork. At 52, he was built like a fortress, 6 feet of muscle and bone, wrapped in expensive wool with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that held all the warmth of winter ice. His hands, soft from years of others doing his killing, rested comfortably on his gun belt as he calculated the value of what he had just acquired. "Clean work, Bill," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education corrupted by frontier brutality. "The Morrisons won't be filing any more complaints with the territorial government." Barbed wire Bill spat tobacco juice into the ashes, his lean face splitting into a grin that revealed teeth like yellow tombstones. Pike's foreman was everything his employer was not thin as a fence post, weathered by decades of hard living and honest about his appetite for violence. Where Pike hid his cruelty behind legal documents and political influence, Bill wore his like a badge of honor. "Whole families feeding the coyotes now," Bill replied with casual satisfaction. "Even burned the bodies so there won't be nothing left to find come spring." Pike nodded approvingly. The Morrisons had made the fatal mistake of organizing their neighbors against his water consolidation project, thinking that strength in numbers could stand against money and political connections. They had learned too late that Pike's reach extended far beyond their small community of homesteaders and small ranchers. "What about the Whitfield place?" Pike asked, though he already knew the answer. That stubborn widow still holding out. "For now." Bill's grin widened. "But I got a feeling she'll be more reasonable once she understands her situation proper-like." Pike's smile was cold as moonlight on a grave. Cora Whitfield represented the last significant water rights between his ranch and the proposed dam site at Raven Rock. Once he controlled her claim, he would own the entire upper White River Dakota territory system, and with it, the power to make or break every settlement from here to the Dakota territory line. "See that she does," Pike said softly. "I've been patient with Mrs. Whitfield, generous even. But patience has its limits, and winter's coming whether she's ready or not." As they mounted their horses and rode away from the ruins of the Morrison homestead, neither man looked back at the graves hidden beneath the ashes. They had work to do, and sentiment was a luxury that successful men could not afford. Behind them, the wind picked up scattering embers across the barren ground and carrying the smell of death into the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a sound like mourning that would echo through the night and into the dreams of anyone unlucky enough to hear it. The dust devil rose from the alkali flats like a spinning ghost, carrying with it the bitter scent of dying dreams and broken promises. Against the towering red buttes that guarded the entrance to Devil's Canyon, two figures faced each other across a chasm that measured more than the few yards of sun-baked earth between them. It was the distance between desperation and hope, between surrender and survival. Cora Whitfield's lips were cracked and bleeding, split by 3 days without water, and the constant assault of desert wind that carried grit sharp enough to flay skin from bone. Her calico dress, once blue as summer sky, had faded to the color of dust and defeat, torn at the shoulder where mesquite thorns had caught her during the desperate flight from what had once been home. 6-year-old Nellie pressed against her mother's hip, small feet wrapped in strips torn from her father's last good shirt. The boots had given out 2 days ago, worn through by rocks that could shatter iron. But it was baby Ida who drew the warrior's immediate attention, barely 2 years old. Her tiny face flushed crimson with fever, her breathing shallow and irregular as her small body fought a battle. It was slowly losing. The child's lips had turned an ominous blue, and the way she lay limp in her mother's arms spoke of a soul preparing to slip its earthly bonds. The warrior himself was a figure carved from legend and necessity. Akacheta of the Minneconjou, Lakota stood just over 6 feet tall, his lean frame wrapped in travel-worn buckskin decorated with quill work that spoke of patient hands and cultural pride. His dark hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and 3 eagle feathers marked victories in battles both physical and spiritual. Most striking were his eyes, dark as mountain pools, holding depths that suggested he had seen both the best and worst that the world had to offer, and had somehow emerged with his humanity intact. Water. Cora whispered the word, scraping her throat like broken glass. Please. For my babies. The plea hung in the superheated air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond the simple request. This was a white woman begging aid from a Lakota warrior, a collision of worlds that conventional wisdom said should end in blood and sorrow. The year was 1876, and tensions between settlers and tribes had reached a breaking point that would soon explode into open warfare across the northern plains. Akacheta studied them with the careful attention of a hunter, reading sign in difficult country. He saw the calluses on Cora's hands that spoke of hard work and self-reliance, the way she held herself despite exhaustion, shoulders back, chin raised in defiance of circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Most telling was how she positioned herself between him and her children, ready to die fighting if necessary, but hoping against hope that she had found mercy in this empty place. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the desert held its breath. Vultures circled high overhead, their shadows sliding across the hardpan like omens of approaching death. The sun hammered down with the intensity of a forge, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made distant objects dance like mirages of salvation that would never come. Then, Akacheta stepped forward, his movement deliberate and careful, positioning his body to cast shade over the fevered child. The gesture was protective, instinctive, and something in Cora's chest loosened for the first time since they had fled Dusty Fork, with Pike's laughter echoing behind them like the sound of damnation itself. "Come," he said, his English carefully pronounced, but carrying an accent that spoke of a first language rich in sounds unknown to European tongues. "Before the sun takes what little strength remains." From his parfleche bag, he produced a water skin that sloshed with the sound of salvation itself. He offered it first to Ida, supporting the baby's head with practiced gentleness as he coaxed tiny sips between her blue-tinged lips. The water was warm, but clean, tasting of leather and mountain springs and hope restored against all odds. When Cora drank, their fingers brushed as he steadied the water skin. The contact was brief, but electric, carrying recognition that neither fully understood, his skin warm and steady, marked with small scars that told stories of a life lived close to danger, and yet somehow still touched by compassion. "You are far from any settlement," Akacheta observed, accepting the water skin back, and noting how little she had taken for herself, despite her desperate thirst. "What drives a woman with children into the empty places where death walks like a patient hunter?" Cora's voice grew stronger as she spoke, anger burning through exhaustion like fire consuming dried grass. "Reginald Pike." She spat the name like a curse upon the desert wind. "He burned us out. Said I had a choice: work for him as his housekeeper or watch my children starve in the wilderness." As she mentioned Pike's name, Akacheta's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hand moved to rest on the war club at his belt, a gesture so brief she might have imagined it, but one that spoke volumes about his feelings toward the powerful rancher. "This Pike," he said quietly, his voice carrying undercurrents of old anger and fresh pain. "He takes what is not freely given. law sides with men like him. Cora replied with the bitter certainty of experience. Money talks louder than justice in these parts, and Pike has more money than most men see in a lifetime of honest labor. Akecheta lifted Ida from Cora's arms, with gentle competence, cradling the fevered child against his chest, with the natural ease of a man who understood the fragility of life. The baby didn't cry, but lay still as death in his embrace, her tiny fist closing weakly around a strip of leather fringe from his shirt, as if even in her delirium she recognized safety when she found it. "There are different kinds of law," he said, his dark gaze moving between mother and daughters with something that might have been calculation. "The white man's law written on paper in distant courthouses by men who have never felt desert sand between their teeth. The law of the earth written in water and wind and the turning of seasons. The law of what is right." He touched his chest above his heart. Sometimes they speak with different voices, and a man must choose which one he will follow. As the sun began its descent toward the western rim of the world, painting the buttes in shades of copper and gold that spoke of beauty, persisting even in the harshest places, Akecheta made a decision that would bind their destinies together like tributaries flowing toward the same distant sea. "My sister has medicine," he said simply. "Strong medicine for fever and food for empty bellies. But the journey is dangerous for a white woman traveling with our people, especially in these times when the government's Indian agents see enemies in every shadow." Cora looked into his steady eyes and saw something that had been absent from her world since Thomas drew his last rattling breath, a man whose word could be trusted, whose strength could be relied upon, without cost or condition attached like hidden thorns. "I'll trust you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had run out of alternatives, but not out of hope. "God help us all, I'll trust you." But miles away, hidden among the rocks that crown Devil's Ridge like a crown of thorns, another kind of choice was being made. Thomas Redhawk adjusted his brass spyglass with hands that trembled slightly, watching the scene unfold below with a mixture of guilt and desperation that ate at his stomach like poison. Pike's men had taken his sister's children 3 days ago, his nephew barely 8 years old, his niece not yet 5. They would remain unharmed, Pike had promised, only as long as Thomas provided detailed information about Akecheta's movements and the canyon's defenses. It was a devil's bargain. But the alternative was watching innocent blood spill for his loyalty to childhood friendship. As he prepared to ride back to Pike with news of this unexpected development, Thomas whispered a prayer to ancestors he was about to dishonor, begging forgiveness for what necessity demanded, and knowing that some betrayals could never be undone no matter how pure the motives behind them. The morning of the burning had dawned deceptively peaceful over Dusty Fork, with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain that might never come. Cora had awakened in the small sod house she shared with her daughters and the same dwelling where her husband Thomas had drawn his last labored breath 6 months earlier. The consumption had taken him slowly, but toward the end, something else had emerged alongside the lung disease tremors in his hands that made simple tasks impossible, periods of confusion that came and went like desert fog, and a metallic taste in his mouth that no amount of water could wash away. The doctor had called it a complication of his respiratory condition. But Cora had wondered about the medicine Pike's personal physician had provided, a bitter tonic that was supposed to ease Thomas's coughing, but seemed to make everything worse with each passing day. The debts he left behind were staggering, or so Pike's representatives claimed when they came calling 2 weeks after the funeral, their ledgers full of numbers that seemed to grow larger each time they were recited. Notes signed in Thomas's increasingly shaky handwriting, gambling markers from card games Cora hadn't even known he was attending, loans secured against their homestead claim with interest rates that bordered on usury. "I'm prepared to be reasonable, Mrs. Whitfield," Pike had said when she came to his sprawling ranch house to discuss the situation. The man himself filled the doorway, like a mountain made flesh 6 feet tall and broad as a barn door, with steel gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in dollars and cents rather than human dignity. But it was Deputy Marshal Will Hutchins standing silent in the corner of Pike's office, who caught her attention and held it with an uncomfortable intensity. The young lawman's face was carefully neutral, but something in his pale eyes that seemed familiar in a way she couldn't quite place flickered with what might have been recognition or warning when Pike spoke her name. More telling was the way he shifted uncomfortably when Pike's gaze lingered too long on Cora's figure, as if witnessing something that made him deeply uneasy about his employer's intentions. Thomas was a good man, despite his weaknesses. Pike continued his voice, carrying false sympathy, while his eyes held the calculating hunger of a predator sizing up potential prey. I can offer you employment that would benefit us both. Room and board for you and the girls, plus wages that will chip away at those unfortunate debts over time. The offer had sounded generous enough on the surface, but there had been something in Pike's manner that set every instinct Cora possessed screaming in alarm, and the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when she hesitated to answer the possessive undertone in his voice. When he mentioned her daughters, the casual assumption that she would have no choice but to accept whatever terms he chose to offer. I'll need time to consider, she had said, backing toward the door with her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Of course. Pike's smile revealed teeth stained yellow by tobacco and decay. But don't take too long, my dear. Debts have a way of growing when they're not properly tended, and winter's coming whether we're ready for it or not. Will had followed her outside into the afternoon heat, his young face troubled by internal conflict that he seemed reluctant to voice. Mrs. Whitfield, he had said quietly, glancing back at the house with something that might have been fear. Be careful around Pike. He doesn't take no for an answer, especially not from women who owe him money. The warning had been delivered in barely more than a whisper, as if Will feared being overheard by his employer, but it carried the weight of personal knowledge that made Cora's blood run cold. As she rode home that day, she found herself wondering what Will Hutchins knew about Pike's methods that he couldn't or dared not say aloud. That night, she had lain awake thinking about Thomas's final weeks, replaying conversations and symptoms, with the terrible clarity that comes from suspicion finally given voice. The way his hands had shaken when he tried to sign papers, making his normally neat handwriting almost illegible. The confusion that had sometimes made him forget her name, or the names of his own children. The bitter medicine that had seemed to worsen his symptoms rather than improve them, despite Dr. Carlyle's assurances that it was the finest treatment available. A terrible possibility had begun to form in her mind, one too horrible to voice, but impossible to ignore once it had taken root. What if Thomas hadn't died of natural causes? What if Pike's impatience had led him to speed along the process of acquiring the Whitfield water rights through more direct means? The decision had been made for her on the 7th morning, when she awakened to the smell of smoke and the sound of men's voices raised in cruel laughter. By the time she reached the door with Ida in her arms and Nellie clinging to her nightgown, their home was already engulfed in flames that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers of hell itself. Barbed wire. Bill sat his horse at the edge of her property, Pike's foreman watching the destruction with the satisfied expression of a craftsman admiring his handiwork. Behind him, 2 other riders maintained silent vigil, hard men whose faces she recognized from Pike's ranch gunfighters and killers who sold their violence to whoever paid best and asked no questions about the nature of their work. Morning, Mrs. Whitfield? Bill had called out cheerfully, his voice carrying over the crackle of burning timber and the crash of the roof collapsing inward. Shame about the fire. These old sod houses, they go up something fierce when the wind gets behind them. The wind that morning had been dead, calm not so much as a whisper, stirring the grass around the burning ruins of her life. "You can't do this," Cora had said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, and the men's laughter made it clear they found her protest amusing rather than troubling. "Do what?" Bill's grin widened, revealing teeth like yellow tombstones. "I'm just here to offer assistance to a lady in distress. Mr. Pike's real concerned about your welfare, what with them debts and all, and winter coming on faster than most folks are prepared for." The threat had been delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed his work, and Cora realized with sick certainty that resistance would only make things worse for her children. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something hard and cold settled in her chest, a core of defiance that refused to bend, no matter how desperate their circumstances became. "Tell Pike he can go to hell," she had said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Now that ain't the message you want me to carry." Bill had replied, his smile fading into something genuinely dangerous. "Not with them children to think about and nowhere to go, except into country that don't forgive mistakes." But Cora was already loading their few escaped possessions into the rickety wagon, with the desperate efficiency of a woman who understood that every second of delay brought her closer to capitulation. The ox was old and tired, but it was transportation and desperation gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Where you think you're going?" Bill had asked, his voice sharp with sudden concern, as he realized she actually intended to leave rather than accept Pike's generous offer of employment. "Away from here," Cora had replied, lifting Nellie into the wagon bed beside their meager supplies. Away from Pike and his kind of protection. She had driven away from the smoking ruins of her life, with her back straight and her head held high, refusing to give Bill or his companions the satisfaction of seeing her break under the weight of their cruelty. But once they were out of sight of the settlement, she had allowed herself to weep for Thomas, for their lost home, for the uncertain future that stretched ahead, like a path through darkness toward an unknowable destination. The ox had lasted exactly 2 days and 14 miles before collapsing in its traces beside a dry creek bed, foam flecking its muzzle as its great heart finally surrendered to exhaustion and old age. They had walked after that following game trails and wagon ruts that seemed to lead nowhere, surviving on wild berries that made them sick and brackish water from alkali pools that left them all retching and weak. By the 5th day, they were down to their last few mouthfuls of water and no food except the leather strips Cora had cut from Thomas's old work boots. Nellie had stopped complaining about her blistered feet, walking in the peculiar silence of a child who sensed that adult concerns had moved beyond her ability to influence them. Ida's fever had started that night, and by morning, the baby's lips had begun to turn blue, with the kind of pallor that spoke of a soul preparing to slip its earthly bonds. When Cora finally collapsed beside the trail on the 7th day, her strength utterly spent and her hope reduced to ash, she pressed her face to the sun-baked earth and wept for the children who would die, because she had been too proud to accept Pike's degrading offer of protection. It was then that the shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see the Lakota warrior standing against the sky like a figure from some half-remembered story of divine intervention made manifest in the flesh. The journey to the Lakota camp took 2 days, following hidden trails that wound through country so harsh it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Akacheta led them through mazes of red sandstone carved by ancient floods across alkali flats where the only sound was the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the steady rhythm of their footsteps on hardpan that could burn through boot leather in a matter of hours. On the first evening, as they made camp beside a spring that bubbled up from the rocks like a gift from the earth itself, Cora found herself watching Akacheta as he worked with the quiet competence of a man completely at home in the wilderness. His movements were economical and sure, gathering firewood from dead sage, preparing food with ingredients she didn't recognize, checking their back trail with the unconscious skill of someone who had spent his life reading the subtle language of survival in hostile country. "Your husband," he said quietly as they shared jerky and water beside the small fire, Ida sleeping peacefully in his arms for the first time since her fever began. "Tell me about him." The request caught Cora off guard, striking her as unexpectedly personal after hours of practical conversation about water and trail conditions. She had expected questions about Pike, about her water rights, about the legal complexities that would determine their future. Instead, he was asking about Thomas, about love and loss and the private grief that had driven her into the desert. "He was a good man," she said slowly, surprised by how much it hurt to speak of him aloud after months of keeping her memories locked away, like precious things too fragile for daily handling. "Gentle with the children, patient with my moods. He could make Nellie laugh even when she was scared, and he sang to Ida when she couldn't sleep." Her voice caught on the words. "He wanted to build something lasting here. A farm that would prosper a family, that would grow a legacy for the children that would outlive us both." Akacheta nodded, understanding his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, like pools of sorrow that went deeper than words could reach. "My wife wanted the same thing. A lodge of our own, away from the crowded camp's children, to carry our names into the future and honor our memories when we walk the spirit trail." His voice grew soft with remembered pain. "The spotted sickness took her 3 winters ago, along with the son we had hoped would grow to be a warrior, and the daughter who would have been beautiful like her mother. The shared grief created a bridge between them that transcended the barriers of race and culture, a recognition of loss that made their different backgrounds seem less important than the universal experience of loving someone and having them taken away by forces beyond human control." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in memories of what had been taken from them by disease and treachery, and the simple cruelty of a world that seemed to delight in destroying the things people held most dear. Pike's medicine made Thomas worse. Cora said eventually, the words coming out in a rush of long-suppressed suspicion that she had never dared voice to another living soul. "The doctor said it was for his lungs to ease the coughing and help him breathe, but his hands started shaking something terrible, and he became confused about simple things. Sometimes he didn't recognize me or the children, and toward the end, he kept talking about seeing people who weren't there." Akacheta's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "Mercury," he said grimly, the single word, carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "Traders use it for mining to separate gold from ore, but in small doses mixed with other medicines." He met her eyes directly, his gaze steady and unflinching. "It would look like sickness running its natural course, but it would be murder as surely as a bullet through the heart." The confirmation of her worst fears hit Cora like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping with the magnitude of Pike's betrayal. But beneath the grief and shock was something else. A cold fury that settled in her chest, like winter ice crystallizing into a core of determination that would not bend or break, no matter what trials lay ahead. "He has to be stopped," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both with its intensity. "Yes," Akacheta agreed simply, but his tone suggested that stopping Pike would require more than righteous anger. "But it will take cunning as well as courage, allies, as well as weapons, and the willingness to risk everything for what is right." The second day brought them to the mouth of the hidden canyon, where the Lakota had established their temporary camp, following ancient trails that seemed to exist more in Akasheda's memory than in any visible markings on the landscape. As they descended the narrow path that led to the valley floor, Cora felt as if she were entering another world, entirely one where water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, where cottonwoods grew thick and green along the stream banks despite the desert surrounding them, and where the sound of children's laughter echoed off red sandstone walls like music made from pure joy. The camp itself was larger than she had expected, perhaps 40 lodges arranged in a rough circle around the central fire, with horse herds grazing in the meadows beyond, and children playing games that seemed to transcend all cultural boundaries. The people themselves moved with the fluid grace of those who lived in harmony with their environment, their clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and quill work that transformed practical garments into works of art that told stories of family history and tribal identity. But what struck Cora most powerfully was the sense of community that pervaded everything she observed, the way adults watched out for all the children regardless of parentage, the way young warriors deferred to their elders while still being trusted with important responsibilities, the way work was shared according to ability and need rather than rigid hierarchies of power and privilege. Wachiwi Akacheda's sister emerged from one of the larger lodges as they approached, and Cora immediately understood why her brother held her in such obvious respect. She was a woman of 23 winters, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that spoke of skill in both practical arts and spiritual healing. But there was something else about her, a quality of inner strength that seemed to shine through her modest demeanor, like sunlight through clear water. As Wachiwi approached, however, Cora noticed something that made her heart clench with sympathy, a thin white scar that ran from the woman's left temple to the corner of her mouth, the kind of mark left by a knife blade, drawn with deliberate cruelty by someone who took pleasure in causing pain. "Takoza," Wachiwi said in Lakota, then switched to careful English as she looked at the fevered baby in Akacheda's arms. "Little one, she burns with a fire sickness. She needs medicine." Akacheda replied, his voice tight with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that time was running out. "Strong medicine, or we will lose her before another sun sets." Without wasting time on further questions, Wachiwi began preparing willow bark tea with the swift efficiency of someone who had dealt with childhood fevers many times before. Her movements were economical and sure, as she worked over a small fire outside her lodge, stripping bark with a sharp knife, boiling water in a trade pot that showed signs of long use, testing the temperature with a fingertip before allowing the bitter medicine to cool to a level that wouldn't burn the child's mouth. "The fever will break tonight," she said quietly, supporting Ida's head with infinite gentleness as she coaxed tiny sips of the medicinal tea between the baby's blue-tinged lips. "But she is very weak from the journey and the sickness. It will take time for her strength to return, and she will need much care." The relief that flooded through Cora was so intense, it left her dizzy and weak-kneed, forcing her to sit down abruptly on a nearby log before her legs gave out entirely. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this ordeal, that her children might live to see another sunrise and many more beyond that. As the afternoon progressed and Ida's condition began to show signs of improvement, Cora found herself gradually drawn into the rhythm of camp life. Nellie was quickly adopted by a group of Lakota children who seemed delighted by her presence, teaching her games that required no common language, and accepting her differences without the questions or suspicions that would have greeted her in most white settlements. "Pilamaya," Cora said hesitantly to Wachiwi as they watched the children play, trying to remember the Lakota word Akacheta had taught her during their journey. "Thank you for everything." Wachiwi's smile transformed her serious face, making her look younger and erasing some of the pain that seemed to live behind her eyes. You learn quickly, and that is good. You will need our language if you stay among us for any length of time. The possibility hadn't occurred to Cora, who had been thinking only in terms of temporary shelter, until she could figure out what to do next. My brother has not spoken of it yet, but I see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Wachiwi replied with a knowing smile that suggested she was far more observant than her quiet demeanor might indicate. And I see the way you look at him when you think the same thing. Perhaps it is time for both of you to stop pretending that this arrangement is purely practical. Heat rose in Cora's cheeks at the observation, but she couldn't deny its accuracy. There was something about Akecheta that drew her like iron filings to a magnet, not just his obvious competence and strength, but a fundamental decency that had been absent from her world since Thomas's death. He treated her with respect rather than calculation, protected her children without expectation of reward, and spoke to her as an equal rather than a possession to be acquired or discarded according to masculine whim. That evening, as they sat beside the fire, with Ida sleeping peacefully and Nellie exhausted from a day of new experiences and cross-cultural friendship, Cora found the courage to ask about the scar that marked Wachiwi's face. The question seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, and Cora wondered if she had overstepped some boundary of propriety. But when Wachiwi finally spoke, her voice was steady and matter-of-fact, as if she had long ago made peace with the memories that the scar represented. "Pike," she said simply, her fingers tracing the white line with unconscious familiarity. 5 winters ago, he led a raid on our old camp down by Willow Creek. Said we were harboring horse thieves and interfering with his cattle operations. But really, he wanted the water rights to our traditional grazing grounds. The revelation hit Cora like a sudden gust of cold wind, making her understand that her own tragedy was part of something much larger and more systematic than she had realized. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "He killed my husband, first shot him down while he was trying to protect the children. Then he killed my 2 little ones, a boy of 6 summers and a girl of 4. Wachiwi's voice remained steady, but Cora could see the old pain flickering in her dark eyes, like embers that refused to die completely. "He would have killed me too. But Akecheta arrived with warriors from the main band before he could finish his work. Pike gave me this scar as a parting gift, a reminder of what happens to those who oppose his will." "I'm so sorry." Cora whispered the words utterly inadequate for such devastating loss. "Do not be sorry for me," Wachiwi replied with quiet firmness. "Be angry with me. Help us stop him before he does to other families what he did to mine to yours. Help us make sure that no more children die for one man's greed." As the fire burned low and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns overhead, Cora realized that her personal tragedy was indeed part of something much larger. A campaign of terror and theft that had been going on for years, claiming victims from both white and Indian communities, while territorial officials looked the other way in exchange for Pike's political contributions and economic influence. The knowledge settled in her chest like a weight, but beneath it was something else, a growing sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She had found more than shelter in this hidden canyon. She had found a cause worth fighting for and people worth fighting beside, bound together, not by blood or race, but by shared values and common humanity. But even as Cora began to find her place in the Lakota camp, the community was expanding in ways that would test everyone's commitment to the ideals of cooperation and mutual respect. 2 days after her arrival, another group of refugees appeared at the canyon mouth, the Henderson family driven from their homestead, by the same combination of manufactured debts and orchestrated violence that had destroyed Cora's life. Jacob Henderson was a man in his 30s, with the calloused hands of a farmer and the suspicious eyes of someone who had learned not to trust easily. His wife Martha was younger, perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet strength that spoke of a woman accustomed to hardship, but not yet broken by it. Their son Billy was 8 years old, and clearly frightened by the strange surroundings, while their daughter Susan, barely 6, clung to her mother's skirts with the wide-eyed wariness of a child who had seen too much violence for her tender years. Indians, Jacob muttered under his breath as Akacheta approached to welcome them, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. Mary, Mother of God, what have we gotten ourselves into? Hush! Martha hissed, grabbing her husband's wrist before he could draw the weapon. They're offering us shelter when no one else would. Show some gratitude instead of prejudice. The exchange was conducted in whispers, but in the confined space of the canyon, voices carried farther than people realized. Several of the Lakota warriors had overheard Henderson's comment, and Cora could see tension building in their postures as they waited to see how their leader would respond to this display of distrust from people they were risking their own safety to protect. "You are welcome here," Akacheta said quietly, his English carefully formal as he addressed the Henderson family. "But you must understand that this is not a place where the old hatreds and fears can flourish. We are trying to build something new, a community where children can grow up judging people by their actions rather than the color of their skin." Jacob's face flushed red with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. That is, we're grateful for your hospitality. It's just that we've heard stories told by men like Pike." Wachiwi interjected, stepping forward with Ida balanced on her hip, an expression of calm authority that immediately commanded attention. Stories designed to keep good people afraid of each other so that evil men can divide and conquer them more easily. The confrontation might have escalated into something more serious, but Billy Henderson chose that moment to break away from his parents and run toward the group of children playing by the stream. Language barriers meant nothing to 8-year-old boys with shared interests in fishing and swimming. And within minutes, he was part of a mixed group that included Nellie's several Lakota children and a young Mexican boy whose family had sought refuge in the canyon after their ranch was burned out by Pike's men. Children learn faster than adults. Standing Bear observed with the dry humor of an elder who had seen many such cultural collisions over the years. Perhaps we should let them teach their parents how to live in peace. The integration of the Henderson family into the camp's daily routine was not without its difficulties. Jacob remained suspicious and standoffish, jumping at sudden sounds and keeping his weapons close at hand, even when performing routine tasks like gathering firewood or helping with construction projects. Martha, however, threw herself into camp life with the desperate enthusiasm of a woman who understood that cooperation was the only path to survival. It was Martha who suggested that the women of different backgrounds should share their knowledge of traditional crafts and healing techniques, leading to informal gatherings where Lakota women taught white settlers how to prepare pemmican and medicinal teas, while learning in return about European methods of food preservation and textile production. "Your people make beautiful beadwork," Martha said one evening as she watched Wachiwi creating intricate patterns on a pair of moccasins intended for Susan. "Could you teach me the techniques? I have some trade beads that I managed to save from our house before it burned." The request clearly pleased Wachiwi, who had been looking for ways to bridge the cultural divide that Jacob's attitude had created. "Of course," she replied warmly. "And perhaps you could show me how to make that bread you prepared yesterday. My brother spoke very highly of it." These small exchanges of knowledge and skill gradually broke down barriers that had seemed insurmountable when the Henderson family first arrived. Even Jacob began to soften his stance as he worked alongside Lakota men on projects that benefited the entire community building. Additional shelters improving the camp's defenses and digging irrigation channels to expand the areas where food could be grown. The breakthrough came during the third week, when young Billy Henderson fell into the stream during a game of tag and was pulled under by the current before he could find his footing on the slippery rocks. It was Fast Horse, one of the Lakota warriors, who dove in immediately and dragged the boy to safety, then spent precious minutes working water from his lungs while Billy's parents watched in terrified helplessness. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly after Billy had recovered enough to sit up and cough out the last of the stream water. I owe you my son's life." Fast Horse simply nodded and walked away without waiting for further gratitude. But the incident had fundamentally changed something in Jacob's attitude toward their Lakota hosts. That evening, he sought out Akacheta by the central fire and offered a formal apology for his initial suspicion and hostility. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About your people, about this place, about what it means to be part of something larger than just my own family's survival. If you'll have me, I'd like to do my part to build whatever it is we're creating here." The gesture was witnessed by the entire camp, and the ripple of approval that ran through the gathered community suggested that Jacob's acceptance represented something more significant than just one man's change of heart. It was proof that the vision Akacheta and Cora were pursuing, a society based on cooperation rather than conquest, was not just a romantic ideal, but a practical possibility. As the days passed and the camp's population stabilized, a routine began to emerge that reflected the blending of different cultural traditions and practical necessities. Children attended informal schools where they learned to read and write in English, while also absorbing traditional Lakota stories and values. Adults shared responsibilities according to their skills, rather than rigid gender roles, with women participating in decision-making processes and men taking turns with cooking and childcare duties. But perhaps most importantly, the community began to develop its own unique identity. Neither wholly white nor wholly Indian, but something new that combined the best elements of both cultures while rejecting the worst aspects of the prejudices and limitations that had kept them apart in the outside world. This is what Pike fears most. Cora observed one evening as she watched children of different backgrounds playing together while their parents worked on a communal project to expand the camp's food storage capabilities. Not just our individual claims to water rights or land, but the possibility that we might prove his entire worldview wrong. Akacheta nodded thoughtfully. He needs people to be afraid of each other, to see differences as threats rather than strengths. If we succeed here, if we show that cooperation is possible. He paused, considering the implications. It would make his methods of divide and conquer much more difficult to sustain. The observation proved to be prophetic, because even as they spoke, Pike was making his own plans to ensure that their experiment in cross-cultural cooperation would never have the chance to prove its viability to the wider world. The wedding ceremony took place at dawn on a morning when the air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the leaves of the cottonwoods along the stream had begun to show the first touches of gold that spoke of changing seasons and the cycle of renewal that governed all life in the high desert. The decision to marry had not been made lightly. It was as much a political alliance as a personal choice designed to give Akacheta legal standing to defend Cora's water rights, while providing her with the protection of his name and the backing of his people. But as Cora stood beside the spring-fed stream, wearing a dress of soft doe skin that Wachiwi had decorated with intricate quill work, depicting the story of their courtship, she realized that somewhere in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect, practical necessity had begun to transform into something deeper and more enduring. Standing bare, the camp's eldest and most respected leader, conducted the traditional Lakota portion of the ceremony with dignity and solemnity that reminded everyone present of the sacred nature of marriage as both a personal commitment and a community responsibility. His voice carried clearly across the water as he spoke the ancient words in flowing Lakota, calling upon the spirits of earth and sky to witness and bless the union of two people from different worlds who had chosen to become one family. Mitakuye o yasin. He concluded the phrase meaning all my relations, and serving as a reminder that marriage was not just the joining of two individuals, but the binding together of extended families and communities in bonds of mutual support and shared responsibility. When Deputy Marshal Will Hutchins stepped forward with his leather-bound book of territorial statutes, Cora noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he opened to the page containing the marriage laws. His voice was steady and official as he recited the required words, but she could see something like pain in his pale eyes, as if this ceremony reminded him of losses or betrayals in his own life that he had never been able to fully resolve. The young lawmen had arrived at the canyon 3 days earlier, ostensibly to investigate reports of illegal activity, but actually to warn them that Pike was gathering men and making preparations for some kind of major operation. Will's information had been invaluable, but Cora couldn't shake the feeling that there was something personal in his obvious distaste for his employer's methods. Do you, Cora Elizabeth Whitfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have, and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, she replied, looking into Akacheda's steady dark eyes and feeling something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this man had become more than an ally or protector. That somewhere along the way, he had claimed a piece of her heart she hadn't known was available for claiming. Do you, Akacheda of the Minikunju Lakota, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have, and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Akacheda replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction, and something else, a warmth that suggested his own feelings had evolved beyond mere duty or political expedience. The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by the entire camp. But even as they celebrated this new beginning with traditional foods and dances that spoke of cultures learning to blend rather than clash, danger was gathering on the horizon like storm clouds building toward a tornado that would test everything they had built together. That night, as the celebration continued with songs in multiple languages and children falling asleep in their parents' arms beside the central fire, Cora felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Will Hutchins standing behind her with an expression of urgent concern. Mrs. Akacheda, he said quietly, using her married name for the first time. I need to speak with you and your husband privately. There are things you need to know about Pike's plans and about other matters that affect your safety. They withdrew to a quiet spot beside the stream where they could speak without being overheard by the celebrating community. Will's young face was grave in the starlight, and when he began to speak, his words carried the weight of secrets that had been eating at his conscience for months. Pike is my father, he said without preamble, the stark confession hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. Not by choice, not by acknowledgement, but by blood. My mother was a Ute woman who worked as a servant in his house when I was conceived. He's never admitted the relationship publicly, but he's used it to control me to ensure my loyalty through a combination of threats and promises that I now realize he never intended to keep. The revelation explained so much about Will's obvious discomfort around Pike, his knowledge of the rancher's methods, and his willingness to risk his career to warn them about the coming attack. It also made his presence at their wedding ceremony even more significant. He wasn't just a territorial official performing his duty, but a son choosing to stand against a father who represented everything corrupt and evil about the system they were all trying to escape. He's gathering men from 3 territories. Will continued, his voice tight with the strain of betraying someone who had nevertheless shaped his entire life. Gunfighters, killers, men who would burn down an orphanage for the right price. They'll strike at dawn, probably tomorrow or the day after, and they won't leave any survivors to tell tales about what happened here. Akacheta's hand moved to his war club, but his expression remained calm and thoughtful. How many men? 30, maybe more. All of them experienced fighters with good weapons and no scruples about killing women and children. Will's voice cracked slightly on the last words. I tried to talk him out of it, tried to convince him that there had to be another way, but he said that sometimes you have to burn out the infection to save the patient. The callous metaphor was pure Pike, reducing human lives to medical terminology that made mass murder sound like a necessary surgical procedure. It was the kind of rationalization that allowed men like him to sleep peacefully at night, while planning atrocities that would haunt their victims' families for generations. There's something else, Will said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He's been poisoning people for years, homesteaders, small ranchers, anyone who stood in his way. Mercury compounds mixed into medicine administered by Dr. Carlisle, who thinks he's providing legitimate treatment for various ailments. The confirmation of what they had already suspected hit Cora like a physical blow, but this time she was prepared for it. The cold fury that had been building in her chest since Akacheta first suggested that Thomas might have been murdered crystallized into something harder and more focused, a determination not just to survive Pike's attack, but to make him pay for every life he had taken in his quest for power and wealth. We need to prepare the camp's defenses, Akacheta said quietly, but Will shook his head. Defenses won't be enough against 30 professional killers with superior weapons and the advantage of surprise. You need to think about evacuation, about getting the women and children to safety before the attack begins. No. The word came from Cora with such conviction that both men turned to stare at her in surprise. We don't run. We don't abandon what we've built here just because Pike thinks he can frighten us into submission. If he wants this place, he'll have to take it from us, and he'll discover that the cost is higher than he's prepared to pay. Her words carried the ring of absolute determination, and as they made their way back to the celebration, all 3 of them understood that the morning would bring the kind of reckoning that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of everything they had tried to create in this hidden canyon. Behind them, the stream continued its ancient flow toward distant seas, carrying with it the whispered prayers and desperate hopes of people who had found something worth fighting for and were prepared to die defending it against those who would destroy it for profit and power. The attack came with the first light of dawn, emerging from the morning mist like spirits of violence made manifest in flesh and steel. Pike's men struck from 3 directions simultaneously, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they charged toward the Lakota defenses, with weapons blazing and death riding beside them like a familiar companion. Cora crouched behind a hastily constructed barricade of boulders and fallen logs, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence that she feared it might burst from her chest entirely. The Winchester rifle in her hands was a Model 1873, its blued steel receiver gleaming in the early light like some terrible golden talisman of war. And the weight of it seemed to anchor her to the earth, even as everything around her dissolved into chaos and carnage. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the morning chill, and she could taste copper fear on her tongue as she watched Pike's hired killers pour into the canyon like a flood of violence and hatred given human form. These were men who killed for money and pleasure, who had no qualms about shooting women and children if it served their purposes or satisfied their employer's appetite for revenge and domination. The first wave of attackers came straight up the canyon floor, their horses' hooves striking sparks from stone as they charged toward the barricades, with rifles crackling and revolvers spitting flame like the mouths of demons. The sound was tremendous, a rolling thunder of gunshots mixed with the screams of wounded men and horses, the crash of bullets striking rock, and the wild whoops of killers who had found their element in violence and chaos. Cora drew a bead on the lead rider, a bearded man in a black hat, who was swinging his weapon toward the area where she could see Nellie and Ida huddled with the other children behind the thickest part of their defenses. Her first shot went wide, the unfamiliar weapon jumping in her hands with more force than she had expected, but the bullet struck stone close enough to the rider's head to make him duck instinctively and spoil his own aim. "Breathe," she whispered to herself, working the lever action with the mechanical precision that Akacheta had drilled into her during their brief but intensive training sessions. "Steady. Squeeze, don't pull. Make every shot count because there won't be time for waste." Her second shot was better, not perfect, but good enough to take the rider in the shoulder and spin him from his saddle to land hard on the rocky ground, with blood already soaking through his shirt. The sight of crimson spreading across fabric made her stomach lurch with nausea, but there was no time for squeamishness or moral reflection. Already another rider was taking the fallen man's place, and the children were crying in terror behind their thin protection of stone and timber. Akacheta fought from a position 20 yards to her left, his movements flowing like water as he worked the action of his repeating rifle with deadly precision and economy of motion. Every shot seemed to find its mark, and Pike's men began to falter as their ranks thinned under the withering fire from defenders who knew every rock and shadow in the canyon and used that knowledge to maximum advantage. But the attackers had overwhelming numerical superiority and far superior firepower. Many carried the newest Winchester repeaters that could fire 13 rounds before topping off, while some of the Lakota warriors were still using single-shot rifles left over from the Civil War. The disparity in weapons technology began to tell as Pike's men pressed their assault with the confidence of professionals who knew that superior equipment could compensate for a lot of tactical disadvantages. Slowly but steadily, the attackers began to gain ground, forcing the defenders back step by bloody step toward the heart of the camp where the women and children waited in desperate silence. Bodies began to litter the canyon floor, attackers and defenders alike, falling to the terrible mathematics of frontier violence, where split-second decisions and fractional advantages in position or equipment could mean the difference between life and death. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Pike's men had the numbers and firepower, but the Lakota had intimate knowledge of the terrain and the desperate courage of people fighting for their homes and families. The stalemate might have continued indefinitely, but that was when the first betrayal revealed itself in the most devastating way possible. Akacheta. The cry came from an unexpected direction, the mouth of a side canyon that should have been empty, where Thomas Redhawk was supposed to be guarding one of their carefully planned escape routes. Instead, Thomas appeared there leading a group of Pike's men through what had been considered an impregnable defensive position. His face was a mask of shame and anguish as he guided the attackers toward the camp's most vulnerable point. But his actions spoke louder than any words of regret or apology could have done. The sight of his childhood friend's betrayal hit Akacheta like a physical blow, visible in the way his shoulders slumped for just a moment before military discipline reasserted itself. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two men stared at each other across 20 yards of broken ground, friends since boyhood, now separated by a chasm of betrayal that could never be bridged. Toksa ake kola. Akacheta called out in Lakota the traditional farewell that meant, "Until we meet again, friend." but his voice carried no warmth, only the cold finality of a friendship dying under the weight of impossible choices. "I'm sorry, brother," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible over the gunfire and his own breaking heart. "They have my sister's children. I had no choice. They would have killed them if I didn't cooperate." The explanation didn't make the betrayal any less devastating, but it did make it comprehensible. Thomas had chosen blood over friendship, family over loyalty, and while Akacheta could understand the terrible calculus that had led to that decision, understanding was not the same as forgiveness. Pike's men were already pouring through the gap that Thomas had opened for them, their weapons trained on the camp's defenders and victory seeming within their grasp. In another few minutes, the position would be completely overrun, and everyone would be dead, or worse. There would be no prisoners taken in this kind of fight, no mercy shown to those who had dared to oppose Reginald Pike's vision of absolute dominion. That was when Deputy Marshal Will Hutchins finally made the choice that had been tearing at his conscience for weeks, and the decision that would define him as either a tool of corruption or a defender of justice. The young lawman had been positioned on the canyon rim above the battle torn between his duty to the territorial government and his growing certainty that Pike represented everything corrupt and evil about the system he had sworn to uphold. The sight of Thomas's betrayal and the imminent massacre of innocents finally pushed him past the point where neutrality was possible or morally defensible. Will's rifle began to speak with the authority of law and justice, his shots carefully placed to create maximum disruption in Pike's coordinated assault. His first bullet took out one of the men who was advancing on a wounded Lakota warrior, buying precious seconds for the defender to reach cover and continue fighting. His second and third shots scattered a group of attackers who were attempting to flank the main barricade, forcing them to seek shelter and disrupting their tactical coordination. "This is Deputy Marshal Hutchins." Will's voice boomed across the canyon with all the official authority his badge could muster. "I'm ordering you to lay down your weapons and surrender immediately. Any man who continues fighting will be shot as an outlaw and murderer." The intervention created exactly the kind of confusion and hesitation that the defenders desperately needed. Some of Pike's hired guns actually did pause in their assault, looking around uncertainly as they tried to decide whether their pay was worth risking a fight with official territorial law enforcement. The hesitation lasted only moments, but it was enough to disrupt the momentum of their attack and give the Lakota warriors time to regroup and reorganize their defensive positions. But their uncertainty ended abruptly when Pike himself put a bullet uncomfortably close to Will's position, and the shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder and making his position on the matter absolutely clear to everyone within hearing distance. "Will." Pike's roar carried clearly across the battlefield, laden with fury and something that might have been disappointed paternal affection. "You backstabbing little whelp, I should have put you in the ground the day you were born, instead of letting sentiment make me weak." The words hit Will like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he had carried his entire life about his parentage and his relationship to the most powerful man in 3 counties. The family resemblance was there for anyone who looked carefully: the same stubborn jaw, the same pale eyes, the same broad shoulders that spoke of common blood and shared heritage twisted by cruelty and abandonment. But instead of cowering under Pike's verbal assault or being paralyzed by the emotional devastation of finally learning the truth about his origins, Will stood straighter on his precarious perch above the battle and raised his rifle with hands that were perfectly steady, despite everything he had just endured. "Then I'm glad I'm nothing like you," he called back, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon and reaching every fighter on both sides of the conflict. "And I'm proud to stand against everything you represent and everything you've done to innocent people." Pike's response was to direct every available gun toward Will's position, turning the canyon rim into a hell of flying lead and shattered stone that forced the young deputy to take cover behind boulders that were steadily being chipped away by the concentrated fire from below. but his intervention had already accomplished its primary purpose. Pike's carefully coordinated assault had been disrupted, and the defenders had gained precious time to regroup and adjust their tactics to meet the changing situation. The battle that followed was the most vicious and desperate fighting that any of them had ever experienced or witnessed. Pike's men, realizing that they were now fighting both the Lakota defenders and territorial law enforcement, fought with the cornered fury of men who knew that capture would mean the gallows and disgrace. The defenders, inspired by Will's intervention and knowing that their families' lives depended on their success, fought with the ferocity of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from victory. Bodies continued to fall on both sides as the combat devolved into a series of small, vicious firefights among the rocks and trees of the canyon floor. The air filled with gun smoke that burned the lungs and stung the eyes, mixed with the screams of wounded men, and the peculiar silence that fell over those who had taken their final breath. Overhead, vultures began to circle in anticipation of the feast that would follow, while the stream continued its ancient flow, indifferent to the human drama being played out on its banks. But slowly, inevitably, Pike's superior numbers and firepower began to tell, despite Will's help and the defenders' intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Lakota were being forced back step by bloody step toward the heart of the camp, where the women and children waited in terror. And it became clear that without some kind of intervention or unexpected development, the battle would end in massacre and defeat. It was then that Pike made his final desperate gambit, the move that would either ensure his victory or seal his doom, depending on how the next few minutes played out. The rancher had worked his way around to a position overlooking the area where the non-combatants were sheltering, using his knowledge of the canyon's layout and the chaos of battle to achieve a tactical advantage that would allow him to dictate terms to his enemies. From his vantage point behind a cluster of boulders, he could see Nellie and Ida huddled together behind a makeshift barricade of supply packs and furniture, their small faces white with terror as bullets whined overhead and the sounds of violence grew ever closer. His rifle was already trained on the children when he began to shout his ultimatum across the battlefield, his voice carrying clearly over the sounds of combat and reaching every fighter engaged in the desperate struggle for control of the canyon. Akacheta. Pike's bellow echoed off the stone walls with the authority of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. I've got a clear shot at your wife's children. Call off your warriors and surrender immediately, or I'll put bullets through both those little girls right now. The threat hit both Cora and Akacheta, like physical blows, freezing them in place, with the terrible certainty that Pike was both capable of carrying out his promise and positioned to do so before anyone could stop him. From her position behind the barricade, Cora could see her daughter's frightened faces and Pike's rifle barrel gleaming in the morning sun like an instrument of damnation itself. You have 10 seconds. Pike continued, his finger already tightening on the trigger as he savored the moment of absolute power over his enemy's fate. Throw down your weapons and come out with your hands up, or these children die and their blood will be on your hands. It was the moment when everything hung in the balance, when years of planning and months of preparation came down to a single impossible choice between surrender and the murder of innocents. Pike's ultimatum had effectively paralyzed the defenders, who could see no way to reach him before he could carry out his threat against the children who had become symbols of everything they were fighting to protect. But Cora saw something else, a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall just above Pike's position, accessible from where she crouched if she was willing to risk everything on a desperate gambit that had little chance of success. The rancher's attention was focused entirely on the main group of defenders, and for perhaps 30 seconds she might be able to reach a position directly above him before he realized what was happening. The decision came to her not as a rational calculation of odds and possibilities, but as a cold certainty that burned away all doubt and hesitation. This was the man who had murdered her husband, destroyed her home, and threatened her children's lives. And now he was using those same children as human shields in his quest for dominion over everything she held dear. Without stopping to think about the consequences or the odds of success, Cora laid down her rifle and began to climb. The sandstone was crumbly and treacherous, offering only the most precarious handholds that crumbled under her fingers and sent small avalanches of debris cascading down the cliff face. But desperation gave her strength and balance she hadn't known she possessed, and the fury that had been building in her chest since Thomas's death provided a focus that made the climb seem almost effortless. She had covered perhaps half the distance when Pike spotted her movement and began to swing his rifle in her direction, abandoning his threats against the children in favor of eliminating the more immediate danger to his position. But the awkward angle made it difficult for him to get a clear shot, and Cora was already committed to her course of action with the single-minded determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Mama, eh." Nellie's scream carried clearly across the canyon as she saw her mother climbing into mortal danger, and the child's voice, high and terrified, as she watched the only security she had left in the world deliberately place itself in jeopardy. The sound seemed to galvanize Pike, who abandoned his attempt to shoot Cora and instead swung his rifle back toward the children with deliberate cruelty. His message was unmistakably clear. If he couldn't stop the mother, he would punish her by murdering her daughters before her eyes, ensuring that her last memory would be of her own failure to protect the innocents she had died trying to save. That was when Cora made her leap into history and legend. She launched herself from the ledge just as Pike's finger began to tighten on the trigger, her body arcing through the air like a missile aimed at the heart of everything evil and corrupt in her world. Time seemed to slow as she fell, allowing her to see Pike's pale eyes widen with surprise, and something that might have been respect for the sheer audacity of her attack. Her shoulder caught Pike in the side of the head with enough force to drive him away from his rifle and send both of them tumbling down the rocky slope in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. They hit the canyon floor hard, with Pike's greater weight and strength giving him the advantage as they rolled apart and struggled to their feet like gladiators in some ancient arena where only one would walk away alive. The rancher's face was bloody from the impact, and his expensive clothes were torn and filthy. But his pale eyes blazed with murderous fury as he drew a knife from his belt, a wicked blade designed for skinning cattle, but perfectly adequate for butchering human beings who had the temerity to oppose his will. "Should have taken my offer when you had the chance," he snarled, advancing on Cora with the knife held low and ready in the grip of a man who knew how to use such weapons for maximum effect. "Could have lived comfortable as my woman instead of dying like a dog in the dirt for the sake of your precious pride." Cora backed away from Pike's advance, her hand closing around a fist-sized rock that had been loosened by their fall down the cliff face. She was no match for Pike in terms of size or strength, but desperation had sharpened her wits and quickened her reflexes to a degree that surprised even her. When Pike lunged with the knife, aiming for her throat with the precision of a man who had killed before, Cora dodged aside and brought the rock down on his wrist with all the force she could muster. The impact sent the blade spinning away across the rocky ground, but Pike was far from finished. His backhand caught her across the face with enough force to send her sprawling stars exploding behind her eyes as she hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Before she could recover, Pike was on her with his hands around her throat, his thumbs pressing into her windpipe with the methodical precision of a man who had strangled people before and knew exactly how much pressure to apply to achieve the desired result. "Been looking forward to this for months." Pike gasped, his breath hot on her face as he leaned his full weight into the killing grip. "Gonna enjoy watching the life go out of your eyes, and then I'll take my time with those daughters of yours. They'll learn what it means to cross Reginald Pike." Cora's vision began to darken as Pike's grip tightened, cutting off her air supply and making coherent thought increasingly difficult. She clawed at his hands and tried to knee him in the groin, but he was too strong and too experienced in violence to be easily dislodged from his position of advantage. The sound of battle seemed to fade away as consciousness began to slip from her grasp, replaced by a rushing sound in her ears that might have been her own blood or the voice of the stream that had brought them all to this place of reckoning. She could feel her strength ebbing like water from a broken vessel, and she knew with terrible certainty that in another few seconds she would be beyond all help or rescue. Just as the darkness began to claim her completely, she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The wet crunch of Akacheta's war club connecting with Pike's skull. The rancher's grip loosened instantly as he toppled sideways, blood streaming from a wound that had caved in the side of his head like a broken eggshell. Pike's body twitched once, twice, then lay still beside the stream that had been the source of so much conflict and bloodshed. His pale eyes stared sightlessly at the morning sky, and blood pooled beneath his ruined skull, mixing with the clear water in spirals of red that slowly dispersed downstream toward whatever distant sea awaited all rivers and all lives. Cora gasped and choked as air rushed back into her lungs, her throat on fire from Pike's brutal grip, and her mind struggling to process the fact that she was still alive when death had seemed so certain and inevitable. Akacheta knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he checked for serious injury, while his dark eyes blazed with the controlled fury of a man who had almost lost something precious beyond all measure. "Our Kantemitawa," he whispered in Lakota, the endearment meaning "my heart" and carrying more emotional weight than any English words could have conveyed. "Are you hurt badly?" "I'll live," she managed to croak, accepting his help to sit up beside Pike's motionless form, while the sounds of battle continued to fade around them as the remaining attackers either surrendered or fled into the desert. Will climbed down from his position on the canyon rim, his young face aged by the weight of patricide and bitter revelation about his own origins. He knelt beside Pike's body, looking down at the man who had fathered him but never loved him, and Cora could see tears mixing with the dust and gunpowder residue on his cheeks. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," Akacheta said quietly, his voice heavy with the exhaustion that follows extreme violence and moral complexity. "No," Will replied, his voice steady, despite his tears and the enormity of what had just transpired. "You're not sorry, and neither am I. He made his choices and lived by them, and he died by them too. The world is better for his absence." Thomas Redhawk's body lay crumpled near the side canyon, where he had guided Pike's men through the defensive perimeter, shot by one of his own supposed allies during the final chaotic minutes of the battle. A fitting end for a man caught between impossible loyalties and torn apart by contradictions that could never be resolved. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky and the gun smoke began to clear, the survivors began the grim work of counting their losses and tending to their wounded. Several Lakota warriors lay dead or seriously injured, and the camp bore scars that would take months to heal completely. But they had won against overwhelming odds, and through a combination of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of desperate ingenuity that only comes to people fighting for everything they hold dear. That night, as Cora sat by the stream with her daughters sleeping peacefully in her arms and her husband's steady presence beside her, she felt something that had been missing from her life since Thomas's death, a sense of completion of justice served and debts finally paid in full. The water continued to flow over its ancient bed, carrying away the blood and violence of the morning and promising renewal for those who had earned the right to call this harsh but beautiful country home. They had chosen to fight rather than submit, to stand together rather than fall separately, and that choice had made all the difference in a world where such choices determined who lived free and who lived in chains. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Cora lay listening to the sound of her family breathing and the eternal murmur of water over stone, she made a silent promise to Thomas's memory and to the future her children would inherit. She would help build something lasting in this place, not just a community or a settlement, but a new way of living. that proved love was stronger than hate, cooperation, more powerful than conquest and hope, more enduring than fear. The promise would be kept, she knew, because some things were too important to fail, and some dreams too precious to abandon to those who lacked the vision to understand their value.